Hello coders, welcome to episode 165 of the How to Code Well podcast. Today I want to talk about flaky tests. What are flaky tests? What causes flaky tests and how to fix them? Because, oh yes, I have flaky tests in the howtocodewell.net platform. Before we get into that though, let's dive into the changelog because there's a few things that I've been doing in the evenings and the weekend as to updating the Kubernetes cluster on the howtocodewell.net platform for the staging deployment. So I can say officially now that we have a domain that is running the ingress controller that's using a Helm workload that does the Nginx load balancer, which is great. That seems to be working okay. And I've got a couple of problems connecting to certain services outside of the Kubernetes cluster that I'm going to be working my way through this weekend and then maybe some of the evenings next week. Once I have those things sorted, we should then hopefully be in a position where I can actually do some deployments, some proper deployments of proper code outside of the realms of DevOps. So actually adjusting things, getting it deployed, and we should be good then. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we should be in a good position. So before we get into the flaky tests, there's a couple of things that I wouldn't mind mentioning, just some news, some articles that I found interesting recently. So the first one is kind of like sowing the seed, I guess, for Podcast 2.0. You may have heard what this is, or you might not have, depending on what podcasts you listen to. I've been listening to certain podcasts recently that have been talking about this for a while. And actually, I've had my eyes on this for a while. The Podcast 2.0 kind of comes in sort of four different sort of flavors, I suppose. Not flavors, but there's parts of it, four different parts. So there's the podcast index, which is the index of all podcasts. Then there is the podcasting namespace, which is the new namespace of 2.0. It's going to have all sorts of new has new XML tags that can be used. And all of this, by the way, is open source, which is why I'm quite interested in it. There's also PodPing, which is it's kind of like a notification system, but it uses the blockchain for podcasts. And then there's value for value, which I won't dive into today because I'm probably going to talk about these in their entireties, sort of give them their own shows, I think, to talk about them. I just want to point you into that direction of the link. So I have a link here to a Medium article that explains those four things in greater detail. And yeah, I have my eye on it, and I'm going to see if there is any kind of backlog tickets that I can write up to investigate these things further from a technical standpoint. So in regards to the podcast namespace, seeing what I need to do to adjust the RSS feed to allow for the podcast 2.0 title to be put on, or the tag, I should say, to be added, tags, I should say, to be added to our podcast thing. And this is benefiting the podcast environment in its entirety. You know, it's improving it. The podcast hasn't really been standardized for a long time. And the podcast 2.0 is a way to do that with new technology. And there is things in there for, say, value for value and the new notification stuff. So it's a way of allowing, let's just say this, it gives opportunities to creators that weren't necessarily there in the beginning. And also it gives the listeners an opportunity as well to have give feedback through this new technology, i.e. through, say, the blockchain, to the podcast creators, which, you know, it's a good thing, I suppose. I need to look into it even further just to see if it's worth doing, if I think that the time spent to adjust the podcast to use the podcast 2.0 spec is worth doing. I know that there are some podcasts that I listen to that do use the podcast 2.0, and do use value for value and do use the PodPing and the namespace and all of that stuff. And they are available on applications and phone apps and stuff that are outside the sticky reaches, shall we say, of things like Spotify and Apple and stuff. And it's a from that perspective, from a creator's perspective, that's quite nice, because then you start becoming more sort of independent and you have more control over things. So I use, for instance, Spotify, which isn't the greatest platform, shall we say, from a creator's point of view, in terms of, creating content. However, it's great from a distribution point of view. But the Podcast 2.0 stuff, it's quite attracting from a creator standpoint. So things like, for example, having different tags that say different things, having transcripts, for instance, that's a really big one from my standpoint. Having the ability to have transcripts in the RSS feed, having the ability to have things like, proper seasons and episode numbers and other things that really should have been there right at the beginning. Anyway, I've talked about this enough. So I've put a link down in the show notes below there about those 4 parts of Podcast 2.0. It's a decent article on Medium that you can read, just because I will probably be mentioning Podcast 2.0 in the future. So, in case anybody listens to a future episode and they're like, what on earth are you talking about? This here is kind of like the kickoff of that. Okay, another article that I wouldn't mind mentioning is that the Symfony logs, there is let's rewind. There is a interesting tutorial that I read. It's actually quite a fairly short tutorial. It's quite a fun one. And this is where you can actually send Symfony logs from Monolog into Slack. So you create a Slack application. So this tutorial shows you how to create a little Slack application, and then you can send your Symfony logs to Slack as a notification. So you could create your own Slack channel and you can send logs to there. I mean, that's pretty awesome, right? Because then you could start looking for certain patterns in the logs, or you can send only specific log entries to like a debug Slack channel. That's pretty cool. So yeah, I've put a link in the show notes to that too, and this makes me think that maybe I could do like a video tutorial on this, or maybe look at how to do this on the Discord platform as well. That would be pretty interesting. The other article that I wouldn't mind talking about is regarding Python. So the normal way of sending Python requests and responses, or handling those, is changing. So usually what you would do is use the WSGI, which, if I get this right, the Web Server Gateway Interface. And this has been around for a long time in the Python world, but this has been upgraded and improved using the ASGI, which is the Asynchronous Server Gateway Interface. So I've got a link here to an article that explains this in more detail and actually gives you examples of how to do this. Essentially, this is using asynchronous code in Python. And they talk about in this article how, the frameworks that are using it. So, for example, Fast API is using it. Django 3 is using it. So this is the asynchronous side of things will help speed up and make your applications better in Python, which I'm quite interested in. Because there are some things on the How to Code Well platform which I wouldn't mind writing in Python eventually, and when I do so, I will be using the asynchronous stuff. So there we go. Okay, so let's get straight into the point of the show, which is flaky tests. So first of all, what is a flaky test? What does that mean? Well, a test that's flaky is a test that does sometimes pass and does sometimes fail, and this usually happens very randomly, and this is incredibly frustrating. This usually happens, or it usually fails at the worst possible time, and it's usually failing for a reason that isn't very obvious straight away. So this can happen in all sorts of test scenarios. So it could happen from a unit test point of view, but it's more often, in my experience, usually happening in an acceptance test. So a unit test is obviously testing a single piece of work, whereas an acceptance test would be testing an acceptable part of the code, right, to make sure that it hits the acceptable criteria. So that usually means like an end-to-end test, so or an integration test, something where we're testing multiple things at once, or a user story. And some of those tests, they can take a bit of time because they need to bring in various different resources, and this is where a lot of the problems lie. But you can still get this, you can still get flaky tests in unit tests. And I've had this a couple of times before, but like I said, it's usually in my case for integration and acceptance tests. With the unit tests, they're easier to fix because it's a single unit of work. So that's what a flaky test is, a test that sometimes passes and sometimes fails. And it's very random when that happens. So what causes a flaky test? Why does a flaky test occur? So this can happen for a number of reasons. For me personally, I do a lot of testing in the dev world, right, in the development mode. And when it goes off to the pipeline, that's usually handed off to another server somewhere in the cloud, probably, that is specific. Its only use case is for the testing, right? So it's got a very single purpose to do the tests. And so it has a set of resources allocated to that. When I'm testing in development, though, when I'm actually on my dev laptop and I'm writing tests and I'm running tests, occasionally a couple of flaky tests will appear. And in my case, this is usually because there is either something on the laptop that's taking up the resources. For example, I could have too many Chrome tabs open. I could have, I could be running tests whilst I'm sort of in a meeting, or I could be watching a video, or I could be doing all sorts of other things on the machine that the tests are actually running. And because the test that's running at that time is actually quite something that needs a lot of resource, and there is a lot of resource that's already being used, then what normally happens is that the tests slow down to the point where they time out, or something happens. You might get a race condition, something obscure happens because those resources that you are wanting to give to your tests are actually allocated somewhere else. This doesn't usually happen when you're handing the tests over to a testing server that just does tests, because they have a specific allocation of resources that is being set for those tests to actually pass. So allocation of resources is usually, in my case, a problem on the development machine. So an underpowered testing suite, right? So also tests that run in random orders, they can also kick off flaky tests. So when you're testing things randomly, they can, in a random order. So let's say you got 5 tests and you're running them in very different orders. Maybe those tests require an actual order to be ran in, but because you're doing them randomly, it randomly fails. That's happened to me before, where you don't appreciate how coupled your tests are. You think they're actually quite isolated, so you run them randomly, and which means that randomly they fail because you're not aware that you should have done some probably tidy up of the tests after they've actually been processed. So that's another one. So tests are not cleaning themselves after they are actually processed. So what I mean by cleaning, for example, getting rid of any artifacts that the test has produced. Say, for example, if you're writing a test that deals with creation of a file and the contents of that file, not having the ability to remove that file after the test. Usually in a test suite, you have some methods that you can call upon that deals with things that happen after the test has run or before the test has ran, or even after or before the test suite has ran. So at that point, you would do your tidy up. You bring the tests bring your test environment to a point that is reusable each time. So clean up your test environment. So Okay, so there's a number of things there, and there are more as to what could cause flaky tests. You could be using, say, non-deterministic values. So, for example, you could have tests that pass at certain times of the day, and that's because you're dealing with dates and times, and you've not taken into account that they actually change and go forward. So you could have failing tests after a certain point in time. There's loads of reasons as to why you may have flaky tests. So let's talk now about how to actually fix those tests. How do you go about debugging a flaky test? Well, what I tend to do is try and isolate those flaky tests. So you want to make sure that the majority of your tests will pass, right? So you've got a flaky test. So run that individually. Don't run the whole suite again. Run that test individually. If that passes, run it again. Does that fail? Run it again. Does that fail? Run it again. Does that fail? Okay, so running it individually passes, but running them together fails. That could be an indication as to why it's failing. It might be the fact that it's the order in which it's placed in the test suite. It could be, again, like I said, something to do with resources. Maybe the resources of the test suite were consumed and not released by the previous tests. So you got to be a little bit of a detective here as to why these flaky tests are occurring. So run these separately first in isolation, right? So you know that the test can actually pass. And then what you should do is see if you can replicate a failing test, right? So you want to look for how to actually make it break and go through your logs. So every time you get a flaky test, fail. Every time you get a test fail, have a look at the logs, see if there's anything in there that you can actually determine as to the root cause. Also, there is a tendency to ignore flaky tests and sort of like mark them as skipped and just, get on with your life. Don't do that. Try not to do that. Try and fix them as a point of priority over the other new tests that you're doing. The thing that people always forget is that maintaining tests takes longer than actually writing tests, right? So you can write a load of tests, like just write a load of tests, right? But actually maintaining them takes a bit of time and care and is required to keep the application, stable. Okay, so check system resources. This is another one. So you want to make sure that you've got enough overhead in terms of RAM, in terms of CPU. You want to run the tests as well as looking at the metrics whilst the tests are running, just to see what's going on, just to see if you can find any patterns. Maybe there is a particular test that's spiking the CPU or spiking the RAM or something, and that will give you an indication. And maybe that test passes, but the test after it fails because, as I mentioned, the allocation of resources has already been consumed. Okay, so you want to check the order that the tests will run and see if there is a way of grouping tests together to make the test load a little lighter. Also, something that I haven't done yet for the How to Code Well platform, but will be doing in the coming few months, I hope, is to actually look at ways to reduce the amount of things I'm testing at once. So my flaky tests at the moment are happening because it's doing an acceptance test. So I've got a number of tests. I've got over 50 tests that run, and it just goes through the whole platform doing various different things as a logged in user, as a logged out user, and all sorts. What I want to see is that would, I guess you would class that as a regression test. So what I want to see is if there is a way of running regression tests on a separate machine, maybe in the evening, maybe even on the cloud or somewhere. I've mentioned before having a server in this office that I just still haven't got around to looking into and getting. But that would be used for a regression test. So maybe once every evening I would point it at a particular branch and run all the regression tests over it. In the meantime, whilst I'm developing, I would only want to test the actual areas of code that I've touched. So for example, if I'm working on stuff to do with user registration, I would only be running acceptance tests on user registration stuff. And there are things that you can do in GitLab that actually, adds a little bit of intelligence to the the pipeline. Sorry, get my words out, to the pipeline that says only run these things if these particular rules are true. And one of the rules would be to look at a particular file. Has that file changed, or that folder? Has everything in that things in that folder changed? Okay, let's run these particular tests. That way you can start being a little bit picky and choosy as to what tests to run, which would reduce the resource load on the actual machine, on the development machine. On the test suite, on say like a nightly build, I would be running the whole regression all the time just to make sure, but that would be on a specific server specifically for testing. Okay, so you want to also check timeouts as well. So you want to make sure that you have enough timeouts to adhere to any kind of sleeps that you've got in your application. All right, so you also want to make sure if there's any risky tests that do any kind of race conditions, maybe something happens before something is needed, and that can cause issues. You want to also make sure, I think I mentioned this about non-deterministic values, so you want to check your inputs. Okay, you want to make sure that you can actually define certain dates and in a static fashion and say these are the dates that we are going to be testing. We're not generating the dates on the fly. Same with numbers, same with calculations, anything to do with any kind of manipulation which happens automatically, you want to be careful about. And you want to isolate, I think I've mentioned this, you want to isolate these tests and just sort of see at what point they fail and then focus on those kind of things. Flaky tests, though, are things that happen all of the time. If your system is underpowered, then that can mean one of two things. Maybe it's underpowered. Maybe there is enough power in your system, right? But your tests require too much. And that is a good test, right? To have all of these tests fail when you have a very super powered machine is actually quite a concern. So what I tend to try and do is create some virtual machines where I'm actually limiting the resources that I'm giving these things. And then I run the tests within those VMs. That's actually a really good way of seeing how your application copes when the resources are restricted. And obviously you want to set some boundaries for that. So don't see these failing tests as a massive issue. Okay, they do need to be fixed, sure, but you could actually look upon these as a success in the sense that these are failing because the resources are too low. So we need to sort the resources out if the resources are too low. Or the other way, the tests are actually doing too much, your code is doing far too much, and it needs to be broken up into smaller little chunks. And so that is a route to refactor and to break things down even further and test those bits in isolation, as I mentioned. Okay, so that's flaky tests. If you've got any questions, thoughts, if you've got any experience on flaky tests, if you know of any workarounds, any fixes, any experience, then do let me know at howtocodewell.fm/contact. Thank you ever so much. Happy coding, everyone, and I'll speak to you again next week. Cheers. Bye-bye.